Hi, and welcome to the Manhattan Project meeting for Saturday, October 21st, 2023. My name is Kainet Thistlethwaite, and I will be your co-moderator for today, along with my colleague Jose Vega. What you just saw was a demonstration of several hundreds in the Cannon building of the U.S. Capitol by an organization called Jewish Voice for Peace, which took place this Wednesday in Washington, D.C. Over 500 people were in the Capitol, along with another 500 outside. The demonstration was orderly and very well coordinated, and there was also no violent resistance by any of the protesters to police. As you just saw, there was singing by the demonstrators, which went on for about another 4 minutes during the takeover. As organizations like the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, and other warmongers are calling for over 2 million people to be driven out of where they live, and lacking any kind of concern for whether they are killed by bombing or lack of food and water, it is important for us to note the kinds of nonviolent direct actions, as was just taken by Jewish Voice for Peace, and to replicate them throughout our own organizing. The International Schiller Institute has just released a petition entitled "Implementing a Global Approach to Ending the Cycle of Violence in Southwest Asia." That petition proposes that three major steps be taken. One, that the forced migration of innocent civilians from Gaza be stopped. Two, that the daily killing should immediately stop through a ceasefire, or even before that, through all means possible. And three, that the United Nations must find ways to enforce its Resolution 242, adopted from November 22, 1967, and that resolution's 2 points: 1. The withdrawal of Israel armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict, and 2. Termination of all claims or states of belligerency and respect for and acknowledgement of the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of every state in the area, and their right to live in peace within secure and recognized boundaries, free from threats or acts of force. People should now go out and circulate that petition to as many people as they know. They can find it on the Schiller Institute website. As Lyndon LaRouche presented in a speech to Central Connecticut State University in 2009, a solution to the crisis in Southwest Asia cannot come from merely that region per se, nor can it come from a perpetuation of vengeance and revenge killing that has characterized that region's history. The solution, as Lynn puts it, is to end the imperialist system that has prevented nations from developing for the past 500 to 600 years. We'll hear from him now in a speech that is as relevant today as it was in 2009.
So what happened, the British created, beginning in the late part of the 19th century, what became the Sykes-Picot treatment. Now, one thing is crucial about this, in all of this, which angers me greatly because I'm angered not at them, I despise them, but I'm angered at my own people, who like fools will kill each other over things that are not really worth fighting about, when there are all other solutions to the problems, and thus making themselves the common prey in their own fighting of each other of an empire. It's like the principle of the 7 Years' War. Get the other guys to kill each other, then you come in and take over the mess. That's the way the British Empire has always operated. This was conscious, too, because remember that Shelburne's advice and counsel was the model of Julian the Apostate, the Emperor Julian the Apostate. What did Julian do which caused Shelburne to admire him so much? What he did was he abandoned Christianity. He canceled it, but not really. What he did is he put it into a kind of temple of various religions and began to play with these against each other. Now, Shelburne's conviction was, on the basis of the study of the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, was that the way the British Empire should operate was the way it had operated in the 7 Years' War, and the way it was to operate in terms of the Napoleonic Wars. and so forth, was to get the fools to kill each other, to play one against the other. Now, this is easy to do. If you get people who don't understand the principle of Westphalia, the peace of 1648 Peace of Westphalia, you don't understand this. Our interest as human beings is not to kill each other or not to engage in killing each other for the purpose of trying to get power over other people. Our purpose should be to set up a system of sovereign nation states under which each group of people has, using their own language and their own culture, is self-represented. But these nations, as such, so formed, must have also a common interest in the betterment of the general condition of mankind. The only thing that's worth fighting for is to prevent evil from happening to this effort, and to promote this effort for the common aims of mankind. Because the human mind is based on creativity, and because creativity is associated with the classical poetry, the best expression of classical poetry of a language culture. In order to evoke creativity in our people, so that our people may prosper and humanity may prosper, we have to promote the welfare of the other nation as much or more than our own. Because it's by promoting in them that which is good, which is creativity, which is the development of culture, the development of a physical contribution to human effort. That's what our purpose should be. Our purpose is not to compete with each other as such. Yes, compete in another sense, but not to compete as hostile forces, but to compete in doing good and sharing the good and realizing that we must develop our people's creative powers through the age of enriching the use of language, especially as typified by poetry and music, to think. And that should be our purpose. The problem, you look at this thing in the Middle East, you say, this is a disaster. What are these two groups of people going to do with this damn warfare? They're going to destroy each other. They're going to destroy civilization by spreading this disease. What are they fighting for? To kill somebody else? To eliminate somebody else? Or they're fighting to make their own people more successful as human beings by finding ways of cooperation with people of a different religious or similar culture. The principle of Westphalia. So we get so involved with the issues of the Middle East, which we find we can never solve. The way we're playing it, we'll never solve it. We will make efforts. Maybe the United States, if it had the right president, could force a peace with the support of other nations. But without some force, there's no tendency for agreement in this region. There's a tendency for perpetual killing. And what many of us can do is try to ameliorate that thing and slow down the killing rate, to try to keep it from spreading, to get them not to do it for another day. There are no guarantees. There is a solution in principle. And the solution is end this blasted imperialist system. And understand that we, as a people, must develop our spiritual culture. That is the creative powers of mankind. To carry further the development of mankind from some brutish character by a campfire 1,000,000 years ago or so, into mankind as we desire that mankind should develop today. That's the issue. In the meantime, we will fight. We will do everything possible to try to get peace in this area because we want to stop the killing. But we're not going to tell somebody we've got a solution that is going to be accepted and is going to work. We're going to say we've got a hopeless cause and we're going to continue to fight for it. But you have to understand the problem comes not from these people, except that they're playing themselves for fools and fighting each other. They're both extremely poor. Do you know what the condition of the average Arab is in that region? Do you know what the condition of life is, the deteriorating condition of life of the Israeli? What the hell are they fighting about? Where's the benefit in the fighting? But the passions are deeply embedded. The habits are deeply embedded. We can try to impose the influence of restraints. try to prevent these crazy Israelis from thinking about an attack on Iran, because that would be really a hellhole operation. In other words, he tried to intervene through diplomacy and through other influences to moderate the tendency for self-destruction of peoples. But don't believe that there's some solution for the Israeli-Arab conflict. There is no solution in that per se. That's why I said at the beginning here, don't look at the history of the Middle East. Look at the Middle East in history, and there you find the solution.
If you're just joining, I'd like to welcome you all to today's Manhattan Project for Saturday, October 21st. We're now going to begin the program by going to Harley Schlanger, frequent guest on the show. So we'll just start off by doing that. Jose, if you could go to him. Yep. Nice to see you, Harley.
Hi, Kynan. Thank you. Well, as I'm sure almost everyone realizes now, we're facing a growing threat of an expanding war in Southwest Asia. At the same time, we have a continuing war, a proxy war against Russia and Ukraine, and some of the neocons are pushing as hard as they can to get a war against China over Taiwan. Now, this was made absolutely clear by Biden's nationwide address on October 19th. He had just come back from meeting with Netanyahu, with the Netanyahu War Cabinet. He pledged eternal support of the United States for Netanyahu and the policy of exterminating Hamas. And then he came back and presented a speech to the United States, to the American people, where he made the link of Ukraine and the support for Israel. Why did he do that? Well, because there's growing opposition to funding the war in Ukraine. This was part of the reason for the ouster of Speaker Kevin McCarthy, part of the reason they can't put together a new speakership now for the House. And so what Biden tried to do was a clever trick, link the two things together as one package. Now, here's what he said. He said, Hamas and Putin represent different threats, but they share this in common. They both want to completely annihilate a neighboring democracy. American leadership is what holds the world together. American values are what makes us a partner that other nations want to work with. To put all of that at risk if we walk away from Ukraine, if we turn our backs on Israel, is not worth it. Then he went on to say, history has taught us that when terrorists don't pay a price for their terror, when dictators don't pay a price for their aggression, they cause more chaos and death and more destruction. And the costs and threats to America and the world keep rising. Now, if you take that second part of his statement, you could apply it to the United States. Where has been the correct blame on the United States for the wars of aggression by America and NATO, the destruction of Libya, of Iraq, of Afghanistan, of Syria, of Ukraine? They have not been held accountable. People like George W. Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld, Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, or Joe Biden. So to attempt to make this a question of standing up for democracy, this is precisely the line of the leading oligarchs through their Atlantic Council, which sponsored a summit for democracy to try and say the divide in the world is between democracies led by America and authoritarian governments led by Russia, China, and now they throw in Iran, North Korea, and some others. Now, the attempt to connect these two funding situations, the war in Ukraine and the war in Israel, is an attempt to outflank those conservative Republicans who are opposing the new package that Biden presented for Ukraine funding. Initially, $24 billion request. In the budget deal that was reached, they threw that out completely. But listen to what leading Democrats are saying about the importance of Biden's speech. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer applauded his plan and said, "We're going to do everything in our power to ensure the Senate delivers the support of Israel and the rest of the package, that is, Ukraine." And Senator Ben Cardin, a Democrat who's the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, concurred with Schumer, and he said, "The linkage has bipartisan support and is our best shot to get it done now." So that's the intent, to outflank the opponents of Ukraine funding. But more importantly, what's the real intent here? Permanent warfare, to disrupt the potential of nations to break out from under the unipolar order or the rules-based order. Now, what we've been emphasizing, as you heard from Lyndon LaRouche just before, the drive for war comes from higher up, above the elected officials who parrot the demands coming from the think tanks and the corporate cartels, but it's the higher ups you have to look at. Now, last week in the Manhattan Project, I went through LaRouche's assessment, which is that both sides in the Middle East have been played. Both sides, the Arabs and Palestinians and the Israelis. And this is something that didn't start just recently. It's an orchestration by the British Empire going back, as LaRouche talked about, for thousands of years, but in the more recent period, going back to the pre-World War I period, when the question was, how do you replace the Ottoman Empire to make sure that it remains under the control of the British Empire? That is, the geographical area, which we now call the Middle East, but which is essentially Southwest Asia. How do you keep it under control of the British Empire? And this was part of the fight in World War I, the intention to keep Germany and Russia away from each other so that the Trans-Siberian Railroad and the Berlin to Baghdad Railroad did not cut out the power of the British Navy to control international trade and commerce. In 1916, there was the Sykes-Picot Agreement, where the British and the French carved up the Middle East to make sure that there would not be a coherent plan for nations to develop, but that they could easily be pitted against each other based on national views, tribal interests, religious differences such as Shiite and Sunni, and so on. And then 1917, they added to that with the Balfour Declaration, promising a Jewish state in Palestine. Now, when you look at the developments of recent days and the war expanding in Southwest Asia, this is what LaRouche said is the result of geopolitics. You look at that area and what's there? It's an automatic natural land connection between Asia and Europe and between Asia and Africa. And it's a sea connection with the Black Sea, the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, the Arab or Persian Gulf, and the Indian Ocean. These were areas central to British control. And that's what geopolitics is about. How do you manipulate governments so that there'll be no opposition to a looting policy directed from above by the British Empire? Now, that's the example, or that's the reason LaRouche says people are played there. Let me just give you a brief sense of what I mean when I say the higher-ups involved in manipulation. There's a fellow called Frederick Kemp, who is the CEO of the Atlantic Council, which is one of the leading think tanks for the geopoliticians and the corporate oligarchs. The Atlantic Council is funded by the British government. It's highly integrated into British intelligence, and then it's funded also by corporate cartels from the City of London and Wall Street. Here's what Kemp had to say about Biden's speech Thursday night. He said, "Historians may come to know U.S. President Joe Biden's speech to the nation as his, quote, inflection point address," unquote, because Biden said this is an inflection point. Kemp goes on and says, "It was as eloquent and compelling as any he has delivered in his lifetime," which, by the way, is not saying much. But then he goes on to say, "It has the potential to be the most significant of his presidency, and it was choreographed to be seen as such. It was only the second time he has chosen to speak from behind the resolute desk in the Oval Office, And he did it with the backdrop of wars in Ukraine and Israel and simmering tensions around Taiwan. Now, to show you that Kemp actually understands what's going on, he does make the counterpoint that as this was going on, quote, as if scripted by a grand dramatist, Chinese leader Xi Jinping and Russian President Vladimir Putin were meeting in China as Biden traveled to Israel, doubling down on their common cause to rewrite the rules of the global order. Well, on that, Kemp is absolutely right. They are rewriting the rules because they don't accept the rules of the unipolar order dictated by the corporate cartels centered in London and Wall Street. They're, in fact, leading a rebellion against it, which includes most of the global South. There were 150 nations at the Beijing conference of the Belt and Road Initiative. And so Kemp has a sense that he's speaking going uphill. But what he's identifying, and what Ursula von der Leyen, who is also very close to the Atlantic Council, said in her trip to Washington, what would happen if the US role as the sole superpower is rejected? And that's what Biden said also, the pivotal role of America, the indispensable nation, as the murderous Madeleine Albright called it. Well, Lyndon LaRouche has been a primary intellectual force in the opposition to this policy, this globalist policy, for his whole life. And the time I knew him, from 1972 until his passing a couple years ago, he gave many speeches, conferences, voluminous writings, presenting an alternative to submitting to this order. Let me just give you, I'm going to give you a brief chronology. I mean, it's such a massive opus of work. It would require many, many days and conferences, and we should do that. But I just want to give you a brief glimpse into what he did and how he shaped this fight, and why today it's the policies that he represents and our organization represents that represent the alternative. Let's start in one historic moment, April 1975. LaRouche was invited to attend a conference in Baghdad of the Ba'ath Party. And while he was there, he met with a number of Arab leaders and came out of there with a proposal from the Iraqis to pull together a $30 billion development fund for Israel and Palestine. Now, this, when LaRouche presented it to our membership, was quite staggering. And he followed the trip to Baghdad with a press conference announcing the release of his International Development Bank, which was a call for a new monetary system which would be coherent with this package of money for developing Israel and Palestine. Let me give you a brief anecdotal report on the magnitude of this. Right after this happened, we put out in our newspaper a headline, Iraq offers $30 billion peace plan to Israel. And I was with a group of people who distributed this at a speech given by Moshe Dayan at Wake Forest University in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. There were hundreds of people there. And we were very much afraid that if we went there and said Iraq wants to end the confrontation and offers money, people would be angry. But what we found out is they were highly interested in it. And we sold every single newspaper we had. And then after the speech by Dayan, I stood up in the audience, Jose Vega style, and said to Moshe Dayan, we have a proposal that Lyndon LaRouche has put on the table from Iraq for a $30 billion development plan for Israel and Palestine. Would you support that? Now, I was expecting a harangue from him because he had a reputation as being a bit of a hothead, a tough military leader. And what he said was fascinating. He said, well, this is very interesting. This could change everything. I'm very open to hear more about it. And it showed at that time the potential for LaRouche's intervention. This is just after the 73 war, after the Arab oil embargo, after what appeared to be an end to any possibility of realizing the idea of a two-state solution to Israel and Palestine. Now, when LaRouche introduced his International Development Bank policy, he said the following: with an IDB policy, International Development Bank policy, in the wind, the pro-peace faction of the Mapai, which was an Israeli party, should soon become hegemonic. The Israelis and key Arab states could readily agree on durable terms of continued negotiation concerning the Palestinian question within the context of immediate firm agreement for cooperation in development policies. Now, with that approach, LaRouche conducted meetings over the next few years, beginning in 1975, when he had a meeting with Israeli leader Abba Eban to further the discussion of this approach. In 1977, LaRouche wrote an article that was published in a Paris-based Israeli newsletter called Israel and Palestine, A Future for the Middle East. And here's what he said in that. In general, without direct negotiations between Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization, there can be no Middle East settlement for the foreseeable immediate future. We all know, all too well, subjective obstacles to such direct negotiations. We ought to know that we must rapidly eliminate the obstacles to such direct negotiations. Now, he's referring specifically to the idea that you should have a political agreement first and then move on. And what he says is that the objective basis for a Middle East settlement is the economic development package we have indicated. Any other approach will fail, will be quickly degraded into farce. However, it is not mere material advantage in itself which provides the basis for peace. It is the fact that the commitment of the governments to realize high rates of scientific and technological progress fosters humanist outlooks in the populations. That was the idea LaRouche had of his Westphalian principle, of the importance of economic policies that show each side recognizing the benefit of the other as the basis of peace. And this was his theme in many, many other papers during that period. And he went against the tide when people were saying, well, you can't deal with Arafat, he's unwilling to make a negotiation. What LaRouche wrote in 1983 in December, Mr. Arafat is the established leader of what is in fact a government in exile of the Palestinian Arabs. If we are going to deal successfully with the Palestinian Arab people, it is with Mr. Arafat's leadership that we must deal. And he then wrote a policy paper, Proposal to Begin Development of a Long-Range Economic Development Policy for the State of Israel. Now, shortly after this, in April 1986, Shimon Peres, who was at that time the Israeli prime minister, called for a $25 to $30 billion pool of money to create a Mideast development fund for the next 10 years. Peres called it a Marshall Plan for Middle East development. And as far as it went, Lyndon LaRouche backed it and wrote several articles defending it. But he did point out the inadequacy of the approach. What he said at that time was that what's necessary is to address the most serious problem that exists in terms of the economy. And what is that? It's the lack of water, and the lack of water and its relationship to the lack of power or energy. And so while endorsing Peres's Marshall Plan, and by 1986, Peres had upped the total to $50 billion, what LaRouche did is he started writing about how you can create more water for the Middle East. And this is the basis of what became known later, by 1990, as his Oasis Plan. What he said is that you need to have a man-made Jordan River, man-made River Jordan, which could flow to provide more water for all the areas that bordered it, including Jordan, Israel, Egypt, and the Arabian Peninsula. He said to do this, you need desalination. You need a string of 300 megawatt nuclear plants. that will give you the power to do the desalination. And it will also provide the electricity needed for industrialization and advanced agriculture. And in 1990, he wrote a piece called A Peace Plan in the True Interest of Arabs and Israelis. And I think I have this as a post, Jose. This is the second post. Yeah. What LaRouche wrote in this is that we need geographic engineering to run the canals between the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea, and then the Red Sea to the Dead Sea, to create water courses which, with nuclear-powered desalination to provide water power and transport, would allow for industrial and agricultural development. Now, here's what he said that's really most interesting. He said, we could define the proper approach to development of the Middle East if no persons lived there presently, as if, for example, we were planning the settling of Mars, an uninhabited planet, by aid of artificial environment and so forth. And then he went on to write that the provision and distribution of water and power must be organized to develop the average square kilometer of land to be productive at needed levels for different types of land use: pastoral, crop, residential, industrial, and commercial. Now, this was the idea of the two canals and the overall approach to industrial development was again seen as revolutionary. How could you get an agreement on this basis? You can take the post down now. Thanks. Now, what happened at that point is that the Bush administration tried to do exactly what LaRouche warned them not to do, to try and get a political settlement. They had a conference in Madrid, which included representatives of the Palestinians and Israelis. But it was going nowhere. The same old arguments, the same old fights, the same old antagonisms. The fact that there had been a number of wars since 1948 and 48 and 56 and 67 and 73, and continued skirmishing and terrorism. How could you get the two sides together? Well, while the Madrid conference was going on, and at the time it was Yitzhak Shamir who was the prime minister, there was something else that was launched when Yitzhak Rabin became prime minister the next year in 1992. And it was a back-channel discussion in Oslo, Norway, between representatives who were close to Shimon Peres, who had come up with this idea of the Mideast Marshall Plan, and representatives of Arafat. And this came to fruition in the September 1993 agreement called the Oslo Accord. Now, what's most important about the Oslo Accord, and most people focus on the fact that Arafat and Rabin shook hands. They spoke about putting an end to the enmity. This is where Rabin made his famous statement that in order to do this, you must have the courage to change axioms. And they reflected that merely by meeting together and shaking hands. It was a very tense moment until the two of them grabbed each other's hands, looked in the eyes of each other, and then moved away and did a toast to each other. A toast to those who have the courage to change axioms. But what was underlying this potential was precisely LaRouche's idea of economic cooperation and development in the two economic annexes that were attached to the Oslo Agreement. I'm just going to read a couple of aspects of this. The economic annex, annex number 3, Protocol on Israeli-Palestinian Cooperation in Economic and Development Programs. The two sides agree to establish an Israeli-Palestinian Continuing Committee for Economic Cooperation, which will focus on the following: cooperation in the field of water, including a water development program; cooperation in the field of electricity, in the field of energy, in the field of finance, including a financial development and action program for the encouragement and international investment in the West Bank and Gaza Strip; cooperation in transport and communications, cooperation in the field of trade, and finally, cooperation in the field of industry, including industrial development programs which will provide for the establishment of joint Israeli-Palestinian industrial research and development centers. So that was Annex number 3. Annex number 4 then consolidates that with the idea of the Protocol on Israeli-Palestinian Cooperation concerning regional development programs. And it talks about an economic development program for the West Bank and Gaza, a Middle East Development Fund, and finally, a Middle East Development Bank. Now, all of this was possible at that time. And this would have done precisely what LaRouche was proposing, which was to create a basis where people in the Palestinian territories would see a benefit in cooperating with Israel, and the Israelis would see a benefit in cooperating with the Palestinians, not just to end the killing, but to create an environment of mutually beneficial, productive activity, which would lift the standard of living of people on both sides of the conflict. And on that basis, a two-state solution would be possible. That's at the center of LaRouche's ideas. Now, what happened to that plan? Well, it was first killed by the World Bank, because by November 1993, the World Bank said they would not funnel money or provide funds that came from donors. President Clinton, among others, was trying to raise funds for this. And there were donors who were prepared to give money, but the World Bank said they would not extend that money to the Palestinians because they didn't trust them because of, quote, corruption, unquote. And in particular, opposition to having Arafat have any possibility of receiving the funds. As a result, the money was just not there. And this was a major problem for the follow-through. Then 2 years later, November 4th, 1995, Yitzhak Rabin was murdered by a man named Yigal Amir, who was part of the settlers movement. In particular, had been very active in Hebron, which was one of the major areas of confrontation between the Palestinians who lived there and the Jewish settlers who were using the power of the Israeli state to move in. And so the assassination of Rabin, on top of the shutdown of the potential for funds, ended the possibility of the success of Oslo. LaRouche had specifically stated in September 93, after the handshake in Washington, that it's urgent that the earth start being moved for these new projects immediately. Otherwise, there's a danger that this proposal will be drowned in the blood of both sides. And he specifically identified the Sharon networks in the settlers movement as the threat to it. And that's what happened. An opportunity was lost. Now, as we see just project from 1995 to today, the Palestinians still have no state. In fact, they now are divided between two groups, one of which, Hamas, which Netanyahu is now vowing to exterminate. Since 2009, Netanyahu and Israel have been providing funds to Hamas to build them up as a counter to the Palestinian Authority. Why? Because the Palestinian Authority is a nationalist movement that represents the interests of the Palestinians as a nation, as opposed to Hamas, which is a religious movement, and which, as long as you have Hamas fighting with the Palestinian Authority, you have no unified government to negotiate with. That's what Netanyahu said. He bragged about doing that. And the estimate is that more than $1 billion was channeled from Israel through Qatar to the Hamas, which now Netanyahu says he's going to exterminate and wipe out. So the solution here is you have to identify what the problem is. The problem is not Israelis and Palestinians, though they may be the ones who carry out the desperate actions. but they're not acting in their own interests. They're acting in the interests of those higher up who want to prevent any kind of break with the old axioms. And we're seeing this happening around the world. Why did this happen right now? Well, I can't speak for the decision-making process of Hamas, but the timing on this is really quite worth looking at. You have the breakdown of support for the Ukraine war in the United States Congress. You have the Ukraine war going terribly. The counteroffensive fizzled out. You may be providing more weapons to Ukraine, but as Putin pointed out, that just means that there's going to be more deaths of Ukrainians. The second point is that you have the emergence of a new counterpole to the unipolar order, namely the BRICS, and the emergence of the global south with a commitment to the kind of development projects that Lyndon LaRouche has been writing about for 50 years, which means against the International Monetary Fund, against such projects as the Great Reset and the Global Green New Deal and so on. And so if you look at this from the standpoint of a Frederick Kemp in the Atlantic Council and the people who bankroll that, a peace settlement in the Middle East would be a horrible agreement for them, just as a negotiated settlement of the Ukraine war, in which what Putin proposed for the last 8 years, security guarantees for both Ukraine and Russia, and a recognition of the potential for the two nations to work together. This represents a threat to the continuation of what Blinken calls the rules-based order. And so that's why it's so revolutionary and important to grasp what LaRouche is saying, both in terms of who's manipulating this, what's the hand above the scene that's playing the two sides against each other. And then secondly, how do you defeat that? You have a movement in the Western nations, the United States and Europe, that reject the unipolar order and the so-called rules-based order and reach out their hands to the global south to work on joint development projects in the benefit of the other. So there is a solution. Those who say there's no solution, they're just the victims of the psychological warfare, which is designed to make you depressed. But the solutions rest with what we've been trying to do, what we've been working on for years, and which is coming together now in the International Peace Coalition and the overall movement of the Lyndon LaRouche organization. So we can make these solutions happen, but it depends on we, the people, not elected officials who have proven to be too corrupt and too intellectually small to take up the task at hand. So that's my presentation for today.
Thanks a lot, Harley. I think we'll actually have a report about the International Peace Coalition, the meeting that happened yesterday, a little bit later. But first, I actually want to play another intervention that our friend Jose Vega did, this time against Rachel Maddow. And this has been making the waves on social media, as you might be able to guess. So why don't we play that, Jose?
Rachel, I'd rather not listen to your boring book because you are here to get Israel wrong yet again. Just like you got 2016 wrong yet again. All you are is the biggest warmonger. You and the rest of the media are the biggest warmongers ever. Why is it that other countries are calling for peace? Brazil, Russia, India, and China all call for peace from the United Nations. And what do? You're just a big, ugly face. You're a warmonger. All of you are just straight warmongers. That's right. Look at what they do to free speech. There's an ethnic cleansing in Gaza, and all you do is tell lies about it. You and the rest of the media are warmongers. Every single one of you are all warmongers.
Bye-bye. 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 Go home. See ya. Ciao. Oh, no. I had a feeling we were talking.
somebody was not happy about something.
Thanks for buying the book.
He was one of the most successful and celebrated.
All right.
Yeah.
Great.
So
Okay,
that happened.
Jose, what do you have to say about that?
Well, I don't know. I don't really have much to say other than what people saw. I mean, I definitely do want to hear what Harley has to say, but I will say this, just that Rachel Maddow is a news anchor for MSNBC, and not only did she get Russiagate wrong, but she got a number of other topics wrong. And some people were asking me, what did I mean when I called her a warmonger? Well, stoking the flames of war through lying, saying that the Russians are our enemy and that they stole our election at a time when people like Hillary Clinton were saying that we need to treat cyber attacks as if they were acts of war. And on top of that, she comes from a network that just propagates lies and brainwashes people. And so she's also said that the Rage Against the War Machine back in February was an expression of the bizarre remnants of the Lyndon LaRouche cult. So she's clearly very aware of who we are. And I just think that this intervention was very important because right now we're at a time in history where the iron is hot, and you're seeing tons of interventions going on right now that there's too many to count at this point. And I'm really happy about that there are other people who are standing up for peace right now and deciding, you know what, this needs to end. And so I would say, that what happened at the Capitol with the singing probably was more effective. But to any individuals over there who see some kind of event going on like this, I would say, do it. Do whatever you saw, do it differently. I've also had people criticize it and said maybe I should have posed the question. Totally fair, totally right. And I would just say, do something. Now is the time to act, and now is not the time to sit on the sidelines of history. But I want to hear, Harley, if you have any reactions. I know you got to get going, but I want to give you an opportunity to react to this.
Well, thank you, Jose. And I do have some things to say about it because it actually demonstrates something. If you put together the two events, the Jewish Voices for Peace singing in the Capitol Rotunda and Jose Vega standing up for the truth in front of Rachel Madcow, as some people call her, this is just the tip of the iceberg. There are many, many more people who would like to do what you did, Jose, but don't have the courage or don't have the depth of knowledge yet, and they're a little intimidated. But I want to point out one of the most brutal ironies of this. You just had an honest-to-God Nazi feted and cheered and standing ovations in the Canadian Parliament because they said he fought against Russia in World War II. Everyone in that parliament should have known that it was the Nazis who fought against Russia in World War II, and the Ukrainian Nazis in particular. Has the ADL said a word about that? About Zelensky cheering him? About Canada's Prime Minister Trudeau cheering him? About Freeland, the Deputy Prime Minister, who's the granddaughter of a Ukrainian fascist, looking like she's about to have an orgasm over the appearance of this Nazi? The ADL is silent on that. But the ADL called those Jewish Voices for Peace in the Capitol Rotunda anti-Semites, when the fact is that unless we have peace based on the principles that I was discussing from Lyndon LaRouche today, unless we have peace, there are going to be a lot more dead Israelis. But not only that, the Israelis who survive will survive on the basis of carrying out an extermination of a people, the Palestinians. And that's a horrible, horrible irony given what many of those people went through in Europe with the Holocaust. So I think it's important that people have the courage to stand up for the truth, the way Lyndon LaRouche did, the way Jose Vega is doing, and Kynan and others of our younger members, the way I did when I was younger, when I stood up in front of Moshe Dayan. And what you may find is you'll get a positive response. Maybe not immediately, certainly not from Rachel Maddow, but it embeds in people's minds. It plays on the doubts they have about whether or not they're right. And there probably are a lot of people in this country, maybe 20%, that fully have bought in to the view of the neocons and the war hawks and so on. But I think the vast majority don't, but they don't know what to do about it. And that's why we put out petitions like the one Kynan read earlier. That's why we have an international peace coalition. That's why I do a daily video update to give people the depth that's needed to give you the courage to stand up and intervene. So I think that's what I'd like to say about that.
Well, thank you, Harley. I very much appreciate that. And I would just kind of add a little bit that, one of the things that inspires me, apart from Lynn's paper on the heuristic manifolds, is that Poe has this dialogue called The Power of Words. And he talks about the fact that all motion creates and all action creates. Just simply waving your hands moves particles that will go around the earth. So what kind of power do your words have too? And also for posterity. And what kind of unseen changes and effects will you make just from acting? So with that, Harley, I want to thank you for being on. I know you have a short time here, so we're going to move on here to our next segment. But I guess, Harley, any final words here before you have to part?
Get the petition from the Schiller Institute website, circulate it, talk to people, and be a voice for humanity. What Helga keeps emphasizing is, while multipolar is better than unipolar, it's better to have a world in which all people see themselves both as patriots of their nations, but as world citizens, as Schiller proposed. And I think that's the challenge to all of us. You can love your nation. You may not like your government, as many in the United States look at Joe Biden and the policies of the government, and there are very few people who support them. But the question then is, can you defend the traditions of your nation, which is our Constitution and our Republican tradition, Republican with a small r? Can you do that and do it in a way that opens your heart to the people of other nations that may be different from us in some ways, but nevertheless share the same basic human values that we have? And that's the challenge. And I think people are up for it, but it really requires as LaRouche used to say, sometimes you need a kick in the ass to get off the couch. So if you have to, do some kicking.
Okay, well, thank you, Harley. All right, so let's transition here to our next segment. If you're just joining us, this is the Saturday Town Hall with Lyndon LaRouche, hosted by the LaRouche Organization, myself, and my friend Kynan Thistlethwaite, sitting in for our normal moderator, Dennis Speed. A little later in the program, we will have Anastasia Battle come in and give us a report on a call that Harley Schlanger was talking about earlier, the International Peace Coalition. And so I won't say more, but now I want to bring in somebody here for our next segment here. And I'm going to be bringing in Paul Gallagher. And Paul Gallagher is going to be talking about the BRICS, some hope, actually, in the world, that not everything is as bad as it seems. As Helga Zepp LaRouche says, the world is caught in a balance right now. We can either choose to destroy ourselves, or this could be the moment in history that people decide to shed their adolescence and become reasonable human beings. So I want to bring in Paul Gallagher. He is the economics editor for Executive Intelligence Review and the former head of the Fusion Energy Foundation. Paul? I think you're muted.
No more. Okay, thanks, Jose.
Yes.
That was an extremely clear presentation that Harley gave. I could almost just take questions from that and try to answer them. But I want to bring in another angle. The economic development solution for peace which LaRouche for 50 years brought forward and Harley summarized. There is also the question, especially now, who is able and willing to implement such a solution? If a group of nations is willing and able to implement a solution like that for peace, and another group of nations, in this case the transatlantic nations, the nations of NATO which are fighting Russia in Europe, if those nations are not willing and able to implement that kind of a solution, will they, for that reason, try to bring down the other nations? Will they, for that reason, take the policy that President Biden no doubt deliberately expressed the other day when he said, our aim is to put Vladimir Putin down? You can read whatever meanings into that you want, but clearly he means to prevent Russia from doing what it's doing, to prevent Putin from carrying out the plans. And what was Putin just doing, but having when Biden said that, but having a 3-hour plus meeting in Beijing at the Belt and Road Forum with President Xi Jinping of China. And at that meeting, clearly, in that extraordinary length of time, most of it without anyone in the room except interpreters, most of it discussing in detail this entire strategic situation and what they could do to improve it. So now you have, in addition to this war, which has been going on for nearly 2 years between NATO and Russia, now you have a war in the Southwest Asia region, in which every previous conflict has been met by the United States and European nations, among others, obviously, but I'm talking about them now. Every previous such conflict has been met by them calling for de-escalation. This one, no. In this one, the United States is clearly calling for escalation, to such an extent that it was learned through the media the other day, that through a leak, that in the State Department the word had been circulated that the words de-escalation or ceasefire should not appear in any tweet, in any public document, in any public expression of anyone associated with the United States diplomatic corps or the State Department. Those words were not to be used. So why are we calling then for escalation? Essentially, in the way that Biden put it forth the other night, let this war roll on as far as it is going to go, as many nations that it may involve. Let it go, let it escalate. This is an extraordinary difference. It's a war in which a glance at the map shows you that the nations all around this war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, the nations all around are nations which have just been brought into the BRICS grouping of nations. Egypt in particular, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Iran in particular. Iran clearly the target of this war. Egypt clearly and right now the target of destabilization as a result of this war. And Saudi Arabia's relations with China in particular targeted as a result of this war. This is the group of 6 nations, with the exception of Argentina was one of the 6. The other 5 of those 6 all surround this conflict. All are threatened with destabilization as a result of this conflict, or destabilization, or worse, direct warfare, particularly in the case of Iran. So it's important to realize where the BRICS formation, not this broader one that is now being formed by its expansion. Where the original BRICS formation came from, it was formed in 2009, then with the final addition of South Africa in 2010, as a reaction to the global financial crash of 2007-2008. At that point, it was clear that the transatlantic nations in which this crash had wiped out, particularly in 2009 in the so-called Great Recession, had wiped out large sectors of economic production and in particular productivity, as well as causing the bankruptcy of many major financial institutions, including all the ones that were then put on life support for 10 years by the Federal Reserve, were nonetheless bankrupt. Under those circumstances, no potential for any further development. In fact, all the potential for the opposite, for further deindustrialization and collapse, were facing the developing sector. And then there came the BRICS, as not as this thing earlier that the Goldman Sachs fellow McNeil talked about, as just 4 countries whose GDPs were going to be large sometime in the distant future, in the middle of this century. Not that kind of meaningless speculation, but rather as a group of nations intending to cooperate insofar as economic development was concerned. Not obviously to cooperate in everything, but to cooperate insofar as economic development for themselves and for other developing nations was concerned. That's where it came from. Now, the transatlantic countries, the United States and European powers, and we'll shortly be able to talk of them all as in the major European powers as former European economic powers. That's the way they are going. Those nations have done very little since the 2008 crash, but to print debt. And just to give you an idea of the scope of it, what they call the total global debt, which generally has categories to it: household debt, of credit cards, of mortgages, of auto loans, and so forth; non-financial debt, categories of everything from investment in new capital goods to buying back their own stocks; non-financial companies issuing debt. The third category, public governments issuing debt. And the fourth, which is usually left out of all the graphs one might see and all the reports one might see, the debt issued and incurred by the financial sector, the banks, the hedge funds, the pension funds, the money market mutual funds, and so forth, usually cosmetically left out of these discussions. But if you take that total, where did it go from the end of that crash in 2010 through roughly 2020, the beginning, the middle of 2020, from just over 2 trillion, just over 200 trillion in the world as a whole, to 307 trillion in the most recent calculations as of the middle of this year, the end of June of this year. A 50% increase dominated, a 100 trillion debt increase dominated overwhelmingly by debt issued by public agencies, essentially government debt, and debt issued by the financial sector. And furthermore, dominated by the so-called advanced economies, which became, through that process, have now reached an average debt to GDP ratio, that is their public debt to GDP ratio, of approximately 135%. 135% of GDP is their public debt, the so-called advanced nations. Whereas the developing nations, what they call the emerging markets, meaning the middle income developing nations, that ratio of debt to GDP is about 65%. And the lower income countries around the world, it's roughly 47, 48%. So you see who it was that incurred this incredible additional 100 trillion in debt in 10 years and concentrated it on their governments and in their financial sectors. And that should give you an idea, starting idea of what is going on now. When you consider that during that whole decade or so period of time, there was no recovery from the economic collapse that occurred in the wake of the 2008 financial crash. There was no real recovery in industrial production, in manufacturing activity. There was no, above all, virtually all increases in productivity, in labor productivity, and in technological productivity in that period ceased. So what was going on was the creation of debt. The central banks made that very easy by keeping the interest rates on that debt as it was issued essentially at zero. In some, to a certain degree, even below zero, but you can say essentially at zero. Made that very easy until suddenly, in the middle of 2022, all that began to change. And from zero, we have suddenly arrived at 5.5%, which has changed the entire condition of that government debt and of the major financial sectors, especially the U.S. Treasury market, which is the biggest market in which those financial sectors operate in the entire world, the biggest market of any kind in the entire world, and has become extremely volatile as a result of this sudden 0 to 5.5% spike organized by the Federal Reserve and the other central banks. So what else they did during that period of time, the United States and the major powers in Europe, the 2015 Paris Agreement and the associated adoption of a way to somehow get out of this increasingly unpayable debt bubble by building a new one. What they did was the 2015 Paris Agreement, the supposed agreement of which was essentially imposed as let us assume that you have agreed to this on the entire world, that industrialization would slow, would stop, would be reversed eventually, that fossil fuels would cease to be used, the chemicals based on fossil fuels would increasingly cease to be used, above all in agriculture, that less food would be produced, that less energy would be produced worldwide, that populations would be looted through this. Lyndon LaRouche was very much aware that this was going to happen already in 2011 when he made a statement about it and said that the continual wars, which at that time were centered in the bombing of Libya by NATO, by the United States, France, and Britain, and the overthrow and killing of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. He said that was leading towards a war with Russia. Now, this, to make this very short, the process and the intention to eliminate the use of fossil fuels as a whole, including in their derivatives, in their products, in their chemical derivatives such as critical fertilizers, across the board, in their use in the production of steel to produce higher quality steel, all these things, that essentially came up against the rock of the Putin government in Russia. And it's from the period from 2015 through roughly 2020, you had the issuance of a tremendous amount of debt, new debt of governments intended to foster all of the green technologies, the ones which are now proving to be so expensive, as in the case of wind power, that the projects for them are beginning to fall apart. But but tremendous price tags were put on this. You may remember that when the Green New Deal was first put forward in the United States by Edward Markey, a senator from Massachusetts, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez from the Bronx and Queens in New York, by Senator Bernie Sanders, whose campaign really was the driving force for this. They had they were not bashful in putting the price tag, especially Sanders in his campaign, in putting the price tag of about 16 to 20 trillion dollars, United States alone, Green New Deal. That much would have to be incurred by the federal government, and as they put it in their program, bought by the Federal Reserve. Essentially, just let's have this printed by the Federal Reserve by buying the debt. That's what this Green New Deal would actually require. So they were building a bubble. This was just the United States frame of it. They were building a bubble across Europe as well, and in some of the Asian countries, particularly in Japan, which was intended to let them write off all the debt associated with that wild debt spree of 2010 to the present. It was intended particularly to let them write off all the debt associated with fossil fuels and just ride on a new bubble, which would come from the green finance, as they call it. That hit a rock when in 2020, as the price of oil, well, leading into that, for the several years before that, from essentially 2016 to 2020, the global investment in the fossil fuels, that means finding them, discovering them, recovering them, producing them, refining them into their products. The global investment in those fossil fuels went from roughly $800 billion per year. This was a huge international industry, from $800 billion per year to $350 billion per year in a period of just 5 years. It was cut by more than half. In the latter part of that, in 2019 and 2020, the prices of oil and natural gas oil first, began to fall, and then really began to plunge to where in late 2019 and 2020, there was the danger the price of oil was going down to near zero, and investment in it would stop. You may remember at that time, King Charles and his circles were all, Mark Carney, the governor at that time of the Bank of England, were all talking about all investments in oil are becoming stranded investments, meaning they're going to be given up. The price of this is going to go down to nothing. Those investments are simply going to fail and be written off. And at that point in April of 2020, an agreement initiated by Russian President Putin with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, that agreement began to take greater control. And actually, they very briefly drew President Trump, who was in his last year in office, into this agreement, gradually lowered the production quotas of the major oil producing nations to a point where the price decline was controlled and then gradually halted. And in fact, in the 4 years or so since then, 3 years or so since then, nearly 4, the world production and consumption of those, particularly the liquid fossil fuels, oil and natural gas, that production and consumption have actually resumed an increase at the same time as the trade in them has been completely reoriented to be within what is now the expanded BRICS, with the BRICS now now including, as of January 1st, with this expansion going on, now including both the 4 out of the 5 largest oil producers, fossil fuel producers in the world, and the 2 largest, the nations which are the 2 largest fossil fuel consumers in the world, China and India. They are now in a reorganized trade in fossil fuels in within what is now the expanded BRICS, and or expanding BRICS, I guess I should say, since the date is coming up January 1st. And that trade among them is clearly aimed at being used to move from the platform of fossil fuels to higher technology platforms of energy, particularly nuclear, various forms of nuclear energy, the development of fusion, the development of space capabilities, space technologies and exploration, and bringing many developing nations into the world of experimental nuclear reactors, nuclear training of scientists and engineers, and the building of actual nuclear power plant capabilities, with the assistance, above all, of Russia, which is the leading supplier of both nuclear power plants and also nuclear fuels and so forth in among all the nations in the world. There was a rock against which the Green New Deal, if you want to call it that, and green finance struck and was stopped. It went on very clearly in the major powers of Europe. And as a result of that, not only are there farmers across Europe threatened with the loss of the ability to continue to produce enough food, not only are their power facilities immediately in the process of losing the ability to produce enough energy to support their industries, which are leaving, but the economies of those countries, the major powers in Europe, are now all in recession, all going backwards, and particularly in the German case, deindustrializing rapidly. What are they doing at the same time? They are throwing more and more of their budgets and money they don't have in their budgets into war, into supporting the NATO war against Russia, and now also supporting a prospective war against China involving Taiwan, and now into this war in Southwest Asia. So the United States is often described in the last year or so as an exception to this relative European collapse. Bidenomics supposedly has pulled the United States through, and we're resilient. We haven't had a formal recession, but it would be useful to look at something reported just a couple of days ago in the New York Times about the United States economy. The budget deficit for fiscal year 2023, which ended at the end of last month, the budget deficit is $2 trillion, not $1.7 trillion as many media were told to report, but $2 trillion. The 1.7 was the result of a trick involving Biden's cancellation of student loan payments, which occurred in the last fiscal year and then was reversed by a court in this fiscal year. But the actual deficit, as the Times in this case accurately reports, is $2 trillion, and prospectively in the years to come will be larger than $2 trillion a year. This is really what's behind the complete chaos among the Republicans in the House of Representatives, because this prospect of $2+ trillion deficits every year, on top of what is now moving towards a $34 trillion total debt, and the unbelievable rate at which the Treasury has been issuing debt since June, essentially since the beginning of June, which has been in the order of hundreds of billions of dollars per month, every month, and accelerating as it goes. That really threw the Republican caucus in the House of Representatives into a condition where no one could control it, as the Matt Gaetz, the representative who started this, the vote to push out Kevin McCarthy as Speaker, as he put it on the floor, this incredible spiraling deficit, the downgrades of U.S. debt by the ratings agencies, the emergence of the BRICS, and he's no supporter of the BRICS, but he included that as among the things which meant that this vast issuance of debt by the Treasury had to somehow be stopped. That was underlying it. At the same time, you read in the same Times article that the tax revenues of the United States government during that fiscal year 2023 declined by about 4% total. Now, if Bidenomics have somehow pulled us through and kept us resilient and growing and so forth, how is it that tax revenues declined? They haven't exactly been reducing tax rates. So you might look elsewhere to see that manufacturing activity in the United States economy in fiscal 2023 was lower than in fiscal 2022. That industrial production in the U.S. economy was lower in fiscal 23 than it was in fiscal 22. And there you might find the actual dimensions of this crisis, which is translating into decisions to try to take down the BRICS. Because there is no policy that Wall Street and Biden's Washington can come up with in order to reverse what's going on economically, to reverse what has actually turned into the failure of the Green Deal and green finance, and the defection of even a good deal of Wall Street from that green finance. They have no policy to deal with this, to make themselves authors of development in the name of peace, but rather they want to take down those countries around the BRICS, the countries in and coming into the BRICS, those nations which are actually willing and able to foster this kind of development which can make peace possible. And that is essentially what you are looking at in a situation where a second war has begun. This one clearly is intended to escalate and intended to strike the nations around, which happen to be the nations that are joining, as of January 1st, the BRICS group of nations. And in particular, the targeted Iran, and in particular, Egypt. It's very clear that Egypt is targeted for destabilization, that the president of Egypt knows this very clearly. He has today and yesterday, he started it yesterday, many of the leaders involved arrived for the session today. He has convened a peace conference in which he wants to defend the rights of the Palestinians to stay in Gaza and in the West Bank territories, with the view of a two-state solution. And above all, that they not be expelled into Egypt, which would both mean that they will never go back into Gaza and could be expelled simultaneously from the West Bank into Jordan, that those expulsions not take place, but rather that a peace conference with the capability of developing these areas take place. And in a very short period of time, it seems like a matter of days, the president of Egypt has organized a conference going on now, which in itself, given who is there and their present attitudes, that conference is not going to issue a solution. But this is the beginning of of what China has called for, Brazil has called for, an international peace conference focused on development of the region, which has been their response to the outbreak of this war. This conference in Egypt is an attempt to get that going, and the fact that not only many countries of the Mideast and North Africa are represented by their leaders there, but also a number of the main nations in Europe and the European Union itself are also represented there on this very short notice. Again, because of the policies of those nations are so much in conflict at this point. This is just a kind of emergency, almost desperation first start. But this is what we have to organize to support, is the bringing about of a peace based on economic development, what Harley ended his presentation by discussing in terms of Lyndon LaRouche's long history of this. This is what we have to go for and support it in every possible way that we can. So that's enough of what I wanted to say.
Okay, well, thank you, Paul. I appreciate that a lot, that report. And we have questions coming in right now about what you had to say, and I think one directed at Harley. But before we go to questions, I want to bring in a good friend of mine, Anastasia Battle. I'm going to give her enough forewarning so she looks okay. Okay. All right, I think she's okay to bring in now. So here we go. Okay. Anastasia, how you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm doing pretty good. Thanks for the fair warning. You always want to give a lady advance notice.
Yeah, sure. I'm bringing you in because earlier Harley was talking about something called an IPC meeting. Oh, and for those who are just tuning in, by the way, this is the Saturday Town Hall with Lyndon LaRouche at the LaRouche Organization YouTube channel, Facebook, Rumble. So you can find this on 3 different platforms today. Also on my Twitter, too. We had just heard a report from Paul Gallagher on the BRICS process and how everything going on in the world in terms of the destabilization is a direct response because of the positive developments happening with the BRICS. And now, Anastasia, coming to you, we want a report on what is this process, the international peace process. What was this call Harley was talking about? Can you please fill us in?
Yeah. So about 20 weeks ago, a few of us got together and decided we were going to create the International Peace Coalition. And this was going to be centered around the concept of bringing people together above their ideologies to break through all of this garbage which limits people from being able to talk to one another. And around this concept of like the coincidence of opposites, what Helga Sepp-LaRouche describes often. And so we've now had 20 weeks of meetings, and we've been gradually growing and have recently had an explosion of growth, a peaceful explosion of growth over the last 2 weeks, with over 200 people on for the last couple of weeks. And this is the group that, if people remember the Humanity for Peace demonstration, this was in collaboration with many peace organizations and leaders around the world, 28 sister rallies in 13 different countries, and it was absolutely beautiful. We had the flagship at the UN. Jose, you spoke at this. But now, where we're heading to right now is, as you can imagine, it's incredibly emotional. This whole Southwest Asia situation came at the worst time possible. In fact, in my perspective, in my view, this was, planned this way in order for it to explode at this moment. Just as the Ukraine war was starting to die down, people were discussing peace negotiations. There was a realization that, yes, in fact, NATO, the United States, Britain, we have been supporting Nazis in Ukraine. Just as soon as this was happening, all of a sudden this situation blows open. And I think that what we've seen in the dialogue, which has been very it's been very moving to me, that you have people who are quote unquote pro-Israeli or pro-Palestinian who are coming together and saying, we need to end the killing. We need to stop this now. And this petition that you just read, Kynan, in the beginning, this was brought forward to the Humanity for Peace IPC discussion, and with some minor changes and an addition to evoke the original UN Charter intention, which is to prevent the scourge of war. The addition of that to the petition itself, we're now going to be organizing around the world to bring about real peace. And it goes through what you read: the ceasefire, getting a ceasefire immediately, ending the migration of people from Gaza, and to bring about the resolution, UN Resolution 242, which people should definitely read and look up. I'm actually just finishing up the petition on the Humanity for Peace website, and we'll get a PDF form so people can get it out in the street. You can start distributing with it, distributing it as a leaflet. And I would encourage everybody on this discussion, I don't care what ideology you're from, I don't care if you think, one side was correct in doing whatever they were supposed to do. People should not die for geopolitical reasons, period. And we have to unite ourselves around creating a real solution, or else this will escalate into a thermonuclear war now. So join us in getting this petition out. It was composed by people who are across the political spectrum and around the world. Join us in getting this out. Get this petition out. It's a version of it is up on the Schiller Institute site. Like I said, it'll be up on Humanity for Peace very soon. And just let go of what you think should or can happen. Because as soon as you let go of those little voices in your head that tell you you can and can't do something, and you start organizing for what's necessary, that's where you find the real strength to be able to do what has to be done right now. And I think that we should definitely organize our hearts out across the political spectrum to make this happen. Republicans, Democrats, Trump people, RFK people, whatever. I think that we really have to bring people together, and that's not just in the United States, but especially in the United States. We really have to do that because we're very close to breaking this thing, and I think that's why we're getting the response we're getting right now. So I wanted to give you guys that report, and people are welcome to join the International Peace Coalition. We have been having them public. They're on Fridays at 11 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, and please reach out so you can get the link. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Anastasia. Stick around because there may be questions coming in for you. People, if you're watching and you have a question for any of our presenters, you can just type them in the chat or email us at the email that is pinned at questions@laroucheorganization.com. So let's go to the first question here, which I will pull up here. This one, Paul, you can answer. And also, Anastasia, if you have any remarks for any of the questions that are being sent in, please feel free to do so. We have a question here from John Crow from Savannah. Other than sharing the word from the LaRouche organization, how can I help fight against the war party? The Republican members of the House won't even elect Jim Jordan to Speaker of the House, even though the majority of their constituents want him elected. Also, a vast majority of rhinos being Republicans in name only, also a vast majority of rhinos voted against him secretly. They're not even courageous enough to do it in a recorded vote. Who wants to take that one up?
Well, I could just say about it that if they had taken a recorded vote, that wouldn't have been courageous either. You don't look to At this point, you don't look to processes taking place inside the House of Representatives or the Congress in general, or in the formation of campaigns for president and so forth. You don't look there for the kind of activity which you must do yourself in order to, or you must participate in it yourself, if better with others, but you must do it yourself. You don't look, that's where you have to look for activity which can actually, as you said, further spread out what the LaRouche movement is calling for and is supporting in this war crisis, which, as Anastasia just said, there's a nuclear trigger between the U.S. Fleets in the area and Iran, with the Black Sea deployment of Russia at this point and the Mediterranean deployment of the United States. There's a nuclear trigger in a lot of places that we don't even see yet, that may have taken the form of, as they often have done in past crises like this on the part of the United States, secretly delivered messages to other countries that if you do X, we will use nuclear weapons preemptively against you. There are obvious and not so obvious, and in your gut as you look at it, that the potential, as Anastasia just said, that this could go to rapidly to Mideast-wide war, to world war, to nuclear war, means that there's really nothing involved in a congressional vote, whether it's public or not public, which is really relevant to stopping that. Now, those young people who were in the Cannon building atrium there, who were occupying it and singing, that is the kind of activity that what we heard about with the high school students in Philadelphia walking out of their classes on Friday to protest this drive for war. That's the kind of activity, if it's given the focus that we're trying to give it, that Helga LaRouche is working to give it with the petition for the two-state solution, with the Schiller Institute statement. These things are the kind of action which obviously you can take, every individual can take, and not necessarily only under the conditions that Jose went into there in that speech by Maddow. And those things will make a difference. And those things will spread the ideas that you say you want to see spread. And electoral politics is not where they will spread, but rather in the process of making real citizens of American residents again, so that they see where their interests lie with the rest of humanity, with the nations striving for peace and development elsewhere, the nations fighting Malthusianism elsewhere. When they see that, they act on it, then this is really spreading. That's all I would say.
Okay.
Okay.
Unless
Great.
Anastasia, you had some response to it? Okay.
Yeah, I do have another question that came in the chat. This is to your presentation, Paul, on the BRICS and nuclear power. He's asking that, are you saying that if an advocacy of nuclear by nations looks like South Africa, that would find a basis for financing in the BRICS nations? And he asks about, what about main population centers like Nigeria, which seems to be way behind on this?
Well, there are many nations that are way behind on it. I mean, there are more than 100 countries around the world whose electricity use is still below 1,000 kilowatt hours per capita per year, whereas China's is near 5,000, despite the fact that it's very densely populated. And therefore, the denser the population, the further electric power capacity goes. Europe is 7,000 to 8,000 kilowatt hours per capita per year and has been for many years. The United States got close to 11,000 kilowatt hours per capita per year. So you see, with that many nations below 1,000 per year, and some of them way below 1,000 per year, there are many, many nations that are behind. You could essentially say that the developing world as a whole, they are all behind on nuclear power. And this now rests on the rapid spread of nuclear power into those nations with the help of credit. As I think you were referencing that. Number one, there has to be credit. Xi Jinping just had a meeting at the BRICS forum with Dilma Rousseff, the head of the New Development Bank, on the subject of the New Development Bank financing more the Belt and Road Initiative projects, which have been largely financed up to now entirely by Chinese state banks, a number of them, and by the Silk Road Fund. Again, it's mainly where it's coming from. That the New Development Bank has to do this. Russia, on the other hand, is financing the development of nuclear power in many nations. That's, for example, right now, Egypt and other nations in Africa in particular, where Russia uses its gas revenue, its revenue from the sale of natural gas, a certain portion of it, to make long-term, very low interest and very long-term loans for the development of these nuclear power plants, which of course take a while to develop and begin to contribute to industrialization and raise living standards. So it's true that the New Development Bank has to be made capable of doing much more. We've written about this to a significant extent, but it's really from those BRICS nations that it is coming, and nations that are better situated, like Saudi Arabia, which has just begun to go nuclear, has already made itself a target of 6% of its power coming from nuclear power by 2030. So they've already started on that route, but they're also in a position to generate credit through the NDB and by other means to help other nations in that region and in Africa to do the same. So it's a process which has to develop much more rapidly than it has. It's been essentially sabotaged for many, many years. And the case of Egypt is one example of how it has now been restarted. Think of the Oasis Plan the way Harley Schlanger described it earlier, with the canal being dug from the Red Sea to the Dead Sea and from the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea, and then nuclear desalination facilities installed along those canals so that there would be fresh water coming out of those canals for irrigation purposes to green the desert in that region. This was something Lyndon LaRouche was talking about and putting in a form of the Oasis Plan already in the 1980s and 1990s. But now, with the advent and actual approval of at least one design for a small modular nuclear reactor, this could be done much more quickly, because those small modular reactors with, say, 60 megawatts power each can be built much more quickly, can then be stacked so that the power available is available immediately, but then grows, and also can be proliferated more quickly, so that you really take those canals as a whole and you're desalinating water all along the length of them. So that's what I would say on that.
Okay. We have a question that just came in here that I think would be relevant for Anastasia to answer, but Paul, I think you can also throw something in here. Anti-war efforts have come and gone over the years and has ramped up in the last century. What makes now different than before, and how do we make sure this isn't just like another Vietnam?
I think it's different than before because we're far closer to nuclear war than we've ever been. And more people are aware of that. And to top that off, you have an international movement around the BRICS nations, right? This whole war scenario is happening because you have a new paradigm which has emerged in the world, right? Nations who are saying we are not going to go along with imperialism anymore. That is the greatest threat to the enemies of humanity. That is the hugest threat. That's why they're so committed, right? This whole, like I was saying about Ukraine, right? They're so committed to getting a nuclear war that they're willing to start it somewhere else. It didn't matter if it was Ukraine. Quite frankly, I mean, I care about the people of these nations, and I'm heartbroken to see so much life lost. The people that are pushing these wars do not care about these people. They don't care about Ukraine. They don't care about Israel. Give me a break. If you wanted to protect the people of Israel, why are you talking about flattening out the region? Right? You have people who are saying turn it into a glass parking lot. I mean, this is ridiculous. How is this going to be any good for anybody to continue 6 generations of war? So I think what you're seeing right now, we're at this teetering point where what we do in terms of organizing to create this new paradigm in the world, right? Helga LaRouche talks about this, that the next 2 years, which are going to be determined by right now, is going to be how the whole world is oriented. What you do right now in this short period of time is going to determine which direction the world is going to take. And I'd say that if we don't organize and get over whatever fears people have of offending people, who cares? Let them be offended, right? We should be calling our congressmen and offending them. They should be very offended, right? Taking this higher road, this concept of peace, is not a popular road. We don't want to appeal to people. You want to organize them to think differently. And that's how you accomplish real peace. That's how we're going to get a new paradigm in the world. That's how we're going to get peace through economic development, is by changing the way people think. Your ability to use the creative capacity of your mind to help another mind understand principle is what's going to make the difference right now. And I think that that's what makes this different. You have people in the world that do understand that, who want to organize for that, but we have to have the intellectual courage to do it. More people need to do it and be willing to put their neck out there to do it. I'm doing it. I'm willing to put my neck out there to do it. I have no idea what could happen to me. Jose has no idea what could happen to him, right? But we need to do this now. There's no other better time to be alive to try to change the course of history for the good. And, the consequences of not doing that will end up leading to nuclear war at this point. That is what we're facing. So, no, this isn't going to be another Vietnam War or Iraq War.
Yeah, man.
Okay, I
Absolutely
do
nothing
have.
to add.
Oh, Paul, I'm sorry. Did you want to say anything to that?
No, I said absolutely nothing to add.
Okay. I had 2 questions from the chat by Munasha and Jose. If you could just put up the invite for today on the screen, I would appreciate that. Because it relates to what he was saying. He asked, his first question is, can you explain the historical reference to the mid-14th century Venetian debt scam and its relevance to the current situation? And he's saying that because we had put in today's invite a quote by Lyndon LaRouche where he talks about it. He says, one is reminded of the mid-14th century, The Venetian war party of that time was known generically as the Lombards, typified by the notorious financial houses of Bardi and Peruzzi. Until the mid-century, the Lombard debts of Europe were pyramided into the greatest, most explosive financial bubble since the fall of the Roman Empire. Then, at the mid-century, the King of England consulted his catechism on the subject of usury and freed his creditors from their mortal error. By repudiating England's sinful indebtedness, the bubble burst. Until that bubble burst, as today, nothing seemed to halt the insanity of the Venetian debt scam. As a price for its submission to such bankers' speculative criminality, half of the population of Europe was wiped out by the effects of the financial looting. It then goes on to describe the influx from the Black Death, but that's his question. And he also asked, with that, how can African countries work with the transatlantic world to embrace the American system, physical economic ideas of Lyndon LaRouche, and promote sustainable development in the region? So, Paul, do you have anything to say on those two questions?
What was the first question? I mean, that aside from the what you read from Lynn, what was the first question?
He said to explain the historical reference to the mid 14th century Venetian debt scam and its relevance to the current situation today.
Oh, okay. Well, on that question, I think that what was just read from Lynn pretty much answers it. That's that was the end of a period in which a tremendous amount of looting of Europe was prepared, let's say, by a complicated process. It involved the Vatican. It involved splits in the papacy in that period, in which there were at certain times two, at one time even three competing popes. But in particular, that one large oligarchical faction associated with the papacy in Venice, the faction in Venice, poured a lot of capital into Florentine banks. This was in the latter half of the 13th century and the beginning of the 14th century, and it made those Florentine banks rather suddenly into giants, which extended tentacles of debt all over Europe and the rest of the world as well, actually, as far away as China, and took a relatively slowly growing but nonetheless healthy developing economy in Europe, and took what was actually a renaissance in China, an economic renaissance in China in the Sung dynasty, and drastically indebted them and manipulated their currencies to the point of bringing about a crash. That crash in the 1340s, it's in there, as Lynn said, led to the Black Death, which actually hit China earlier, killed as large a portion of the population of China as it did subsequently in Europe, and devastated what was then really the world economy, until Brunelleschi and others like him began the process of Nicholas of Cusa began the process of bringing back into European knowledge the ideas of classical Greece, especially the ideas of Plato, the conceptions of knowledge of Plato, and what the relationship of knowledge of the human mind is to knowledge of the social world and the physical world. And that was expressed in part through painting, and then subsequently through music, but in particular, at first through what was really religious painting, in such a way that populations began to become more human in those devastated areas of Europe in particular. And what came out of it was the European Golden Renaissance, as it's called. So we obviously hope that no such terminal collapse of this financial bubble occurs in this case, because it is so huge as a result of this, the last 15 years of debt printing in particular. It is so huge that it would have devastating consequences, and just the threat of it, as we've been discussing, has been driving nations into adopting policies of war, which could very quickly lead to nuclear war. So that's, I think, the background to that. I'm not remembering what the second part of the question was.
Hold on, I'll get to it right now. He was asking, how can African countries work with the transatlantic world to embrace the American system, physical economic ideas of Lyndon LaRouche, and promote development in the region?
Well, a lot of the African countries are already working with the BRICS as it expands. It will include now Egypt and Ethiopia, as well as South Africa, and will have many other African nations looking to it for credit, for scientific advancement, for industrialization on a higher technological level, including nuclear power. Now, the leading effort in that all along has been, the last 10 years, has been the Belt and Road Initiative. And everybody knows, I think, that China was contributing half of all the economic growth in the world in the decade that followed the 2008 crash and the so-called Great Recession. So the world was depending on China and on that Belt and Road Initiative for progress, for industrialization. So, as we've said in our organizing, in pamphlet after pamphlet, in great detail, the United States has a really extraordinary history in terms of being at times the most rapidly industrializing and the leading industrial power in the world as a result of credit policies associated with Alexander Hamilton, as a result of the policies of developing high technology manufacturing and higher technology, which came through the application of these ideas that really originated with Hamilton in the American system context. So the United States has a glorious early history and 19th century history in this regard, which countries like Japan, Germany, Russia, China, all then took up and made their policies during the 20th century, and particularly the late 20th and early 21st century for China, in offering this kind of development to African countries, which, let us say, need it more than any other developing countries. So the United States should join with that, go back to its origins as a powerful industrializing engine for other parts of the world, a fountain of growth policy which can be sustained for the rest of the world. Go back to that and join with the Belt and Road Initiative, join with the BRICS countries in industrializing the rest of the developing nations.
Okay, I think we're coming up on time, Jose. So unless you have anything else, I think we can just go to summary remarks. Yeah, so Anastasia, why don't I just start with you if you have anything to end off with?
Yeah, I'd say that, I mean, I've emphasized this with people on our shows in the past, but, really pull together as much thoughtfulness as you possibly can. I highly recommend reading Percy B. Shelley's In Defense of Poetry to really get an understanding of what's happening and changing in the world. Because in order to really understand the dynamic of how everything is functioning, you have to think about how human dynamics really operate when there's great change going on. And then you'll gain insight into how things are are moving and how you can intervene into that process. That's how I think about what's happening in my organizing, how I approach people, is not just reacting to a tit for tat kind of thing, or just having knee-jerk responses to everything that's going on around me, but to think through, how can I raise up the people that I'm talking to this higher level. And I think that this petition that we just put out, which will be on the Humanity for Peace website, which is already up on the Schiller Institute website, you can use that as part of your intervention. Because if somebody says no, don't react to that. That's actually an organizing opportunity. You'll be able to test yourself and your understanding of what's really going on in the world to be able to pull that person into reality. And that's really what we have to fight for, right? People are not going to agree with us on every single level, but that's where organizing comes in. So definitely do that, get the petition out. And secondly, I put the link inside the chat, but I'm going to say it here. Sign up for the EIR Daily Alert. This is the best political intelligence you're going to get. It's what Harley reads. Paul, he writes for it. He writes this. So if you want to actually get an understanding of what's really going on in the world, subscribe to the EIR Daily Alert to get that sent to you every day of the week. There's a new website that was just created, so it's much easier to use online. So please do that.
Great. Paul, anything?
Well, when Shelley's defense of poetry is raised, I would just say, again, absolutely. I mean, we've been talking in terms, to a significant extent, in terms of nations in Harley's presentation and in mine. But in the questions, it has come down to where saving this situation really lies, which is in individuals. And in Percy Shelley's pamphlets that he wrote, as well as in the Defense of Poetry, an article he wrote later. In the years in which he was, in his short life, in which he was both a poet and a pamphleteer, writing and distributing his own pamphlets, he emphasized that there are periods like this, periods of crisis, and this is clearly such a period, in which the interests of the family become the interests of the broader society, and the heart of the individual beats for the species as a whole, in which people cease to, because of crisis, because they are struck and to a certain extent productively terrified by a crisis, people cease to think only of their own interests, their own family, their narrow concerns, but rather open their minds and their hearts to the human race as a whole. And as Shelley put it, the individual's nation becomes the entire human race. And as people in large numbers find themselves provoked to think that way, then we organize them. We're trying to think that way all the time. And so in that kind of a situation, then we and you can organize them much more quickly and effectively. And again, there are allies out there. There are things which have already been put in motion. There have been calls for an international peace and development conference by China, and then echoing that by Brazil. Helga LaRouche has been drawing attention in particular to that prospect. Those nations are pushing for that. Support it, go with it. Now the Egyptian initiative, but the initiative also that you saw in the videotapes, Jose's initiative, the initiative of the Jewish Voice for Peace youth in the Cannon office building, the other initiatives that are being taken of that kind, there are a lot of them. We have to find them and organize in those situations. And we'll find that it is in what Shelley discussed as a period of extraordinary openness to the reform of the affairs of mankind, is the way he always put it. We might use other words, but that's fine.
Great. I think that's a perfect spot to end. So I just want to thank you, Paul, Anastasia Battle, Jose Vega, my co-moderator, and we'll see you next Saturday at 2 p.m. Eastern. So take care, everyone.